Focus on Asia, what President Trump is saying about the U.S. trade war with China and the unrest in Hong Kong. Fight for the unborn. Planned Parenthood makes an announcement about receiving federal funding. We have pro-life analysis. The Feast of the Assumption, how a 17th century artist depicted Mary's Assumption into heaven. And signing on. Today is an important one for EWTN and our foundress, Mother Angelica. We'll explain. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, August 15th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We're seeing a wild ride on Wall Street this week due to fear of recession and the U.S. trade war with China. The communist country is also dealing with growing unrest in Hong Kong. President Donald Trump is weighing in. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports.
The U.S. economy has seen record economic growth and a strong job market, but some say President Trump's trade war with China could cause a slowdown.
If the president can't figure out a way to find some kind of face-saving arrangement with China pretty soon, we will be in recession. Stocks in Asia and Europe sank after China said it would take necessary countermeasures if President Trump follows through on a threat to impose tariffs on more than $100 billion of Chinese goods on September 1st. President Trump tweeted yesterday, "Of course China wants to make a deal. Let them work humanely with Hong Kong first." Hong Kong has witnessed growing opposition over a rollback of rights. Protesters are upset with the loss of freedom in the territory overseen by China. The U.S. State Department yesterday issued a travel advisory for Hong Kong saying Americans should keep a low profile and avoid the areas of the demonstrations. Police are running out of patience.
I would like to stress that police always respect the right to assembly and freedom of speech, but using violence to achieve their goals are not to be tolerated.
And a Chinese ambassador says if Hong Kong doesn't control extremists and terrorists, then China's central government will intervene.
The movement has gone way beyond the free assembly and peaceful protests. It is posing a severe challenge to law and order in Hong Kong.
Hundreds of Catholics have marched in these Hong Kong protests. The auxiliary bishop, Joseph Ha Chi-shing, is urging peaceful demonstrations. He says violence will only create more violence. Wyatt?
And we'll be watching to see if there is a reduction of violence. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Thanks, Mark. Israel has banned 2 Democratic congresswomen from entering the country. Rashid Tlaib of Michigan on the left and Ilhan Omar of Minnesota have been vocal critics of the state of Israel. They had refused to be escorted by Israeli security during their proposed trip. They planned to visit the Temple Mount, one of the holiest sites in Jerusalem. Earlier in the day, President Trump weighed in on Twitter, saying, quote, "It would show great weakness if Israel allowed Representative Omar and Representative Tlaib to visit. They hate Israel and all Jewish people, and there is nothing that can be said or done to change their minds." A surge of sexual abuse lawsuits were filed yesterday in New York. The state opened its 1-year window for abuse cases blocked by the previous statute of limitations.
I hope that my faith is restored in the church. I've been having trouble with my religious practice over the years, just getting back there. I hope that can be renewed, and I hope that we shouldn't have to think twice about, sending children, especially to Catholic schools, Catholic church events, Catholic organizations.
The Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, schools, and hospitals are some of those named in claims. Hundreds of people have sued the church or one of several New York dioceses. The head of the Diocese of San Diego announces a compensation fund for survivors of clergy sexual abuse. Bishop Robert McElroy also calls on every employee of the diocese to report allegations of misconduct to the proper authorities. Parish funds will not be used to compensate victims. For more on this story, including what the diocese is doing about abuse claims that predate the California statute of limitations, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. 6 police officers were wounded in a standoff with a gunman yesterday in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The dramatic situation lasted nearly 8 hours. The city's police commissioner says it began when officers went to serve a warrant at a home. 2 police officers ended up being trapped inside the house. The commissioner also says it is amazing no one was killed. The suspect was taken into custody. Two guards responsible for Jeffrey Epstein on the night of his death are under investigation. One of the guards was working a 5th straight day of overtime, and the other was on mandatory overtime. Federal investigators are looking into whether the guards were sleeping on the job and falsified log entries. The two guards have been placed on leave. Planned Parenthood says it will leave the Title X family planning program. It says it cannot comply with a new regulation barring organizations that perform abortions or refer women to get them from receiving federal funds. The nation's largest abortion provider says it will withdraw from the program by Monday. That is, unless an appeals court in San Francisco intervenes. Officials at the Department of Health and Human Services say Planned Parenthood is placing a priority on abortion and not, quote, a broad range of acceptable and effective family planning methods. For analysis, we're joined by Alexandra Desanctis, staff writer for National Review, a conservative editorial magazine. Alexandra, welcome in. Can you walk us through and tell us what Planned Parenthood is doing here, what their strategy, and how much money are they walking away?
Sure. What the Title X Family Planning Program gives Planned Parenthood about $60 million a year, which is a small percentage of Planned Parenthood's federal funding. Most of it comes from Medicaid reimbursement, so this is somewhere around 15% of Planned Parenthood's annual federal funding. But what they're doing here is saying we want to both have the right to perform abortions and to refer women to get abortions elsewhere and also continue receiving our federal funding. And that the Trump administration is saying pro-life taxpayers have a right not to have their money going towards abortion. You need to financially separate your provision of abortion if you want to continue being part of the family planning program, and Planned Parenthood is choosing abortion over that.
Clearly. What do you think this says about Planned Parenthood's priorities?
I think it's very obvious this is an abortion corporation, and it's interesting because we hear all the time from Planned Parenthood and its officials and in its annual reports, abortion is just 3% of what we do. You know, it's not a big deal, nothing to see here. We're a healthcare organization. And then it comes time to, split abortion financially away from everything else they're doing, and they say, sorry, this is much too essential. We can't really set that aside, right? So which is it?
The money speaks volumes, doesn't it? You yourself are a Catholic and you're pro-life. How do you think the pro-life movement should react to this kind of news?
I think it's pretty obvious that Planned Parenthood, again, is focused on abortion, and they get away all the time with saying they care about women, they care about women's health care. But the fact of the matter is, if they actually cared about women and wanted to provide health care, they would prioritize that and would prioritize receiving this kind of federal funding over sort of running up the abortion numbers, and they clearly don't. So I think for pro-lifers, it's an important piece of evidence we can use to explain to people Planned Parenthood is not pro-woman.
And Planned Parenthood, I should say pro-life movement, has been consistent about calling out Planned Parenthood for that kind of thing. I want to switch gears just a little bit and ask you, because in an article this week, you said Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg is guilty of moral hypocrisy. Explain what you meant by that.
Pete Buttigieg has spent a lot of his campaign talking about his Christian faith. He's an Episcopalian, and he very often criticizes Republicans for not being Christian enough. He says, so-called Christian conservative senators won't raise the minimum wage, and, so-called Republican Christians support a party that's separating families at the border. This is not something that God would smile on, is the way that he put it. But then at the same time, every time that he's asked about abortion and sort of where we draw the line, he says, well, that's a moral question, and we have to leave it up to women to decide. And so my point is not necessarily, I'm not going to call Pete Buttigieg a bad Christian the way he would call me one, right? He can sort that out with his maker. But if he's going to sort of make moral assertions on some issues, I think he's sort of responsible for doing that on all of them.
Okay, we'll continue to follow that, of course, and see if he says any more about the issue of abortion, because it is important. Alexandra Desanctis, staff writer for National Review. Thanks so much.
Great to be here.
The United States is seeking to stop the release of an Iranian ship detained for breaching European Union sanctions. The supertanker was suspected of making oil shipments to Syria. Its release was seen as an attempt by London to diffuse tensions with Tehran. There was no immediate reaction from authorities in Iran. An Australian court will rule next week on Cardinal George Pell's appeal. Pell is the most senior Catholic clergyman to be found guilty of child sex abuse. He could walk free if the judges acquit him of the 5 convictions for molesting 2 choir boys in a cathedral more than 2 decades ago. His case is likely to end up in Australia's High Court. The faithful in France celebrated the Feast of the Assumption with a parade around Notre Dame Cathedral. It included a statue of the Blessed Virgin rescued from the fire last April that nearly engulfed the church. Archbishop Michel Opite led the procession. Coming up, we hear from the head of EWTN's new news service in Africa on the day of its launch, and a preview of the Pope's trip to Mozambique.
eternal word be proclaimed.
Today is the 38th anniversary of the on-air launch of EWTN. In 1981, EWTN reached roughly 60,000 homes. Today, we're the largest religious media network in the world, reaching more than 300 million homes in more than 145 countries. And we are growing. Today is an exciting day for EWTN as we launch a new service in Africa. Earlier this year in Rome, EWTN Chairman and CEO Michael Warsaw announced Aussie Africa with the goal of covering all of Africa for Africa. Aussie Africa is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And that's where we find Father Don Bosco Anyala, a priest originally from South Sudan. Father is the editor-in-chief of Aussie Africa. Father, welcome back. Today's launch has been a long time in the making. Tell us about the need for this new service on the African continent.
Thank you very much for having me again to tell you about the launch of SCI Africa on the African continent. There is a need to tell the Africa story by the Africans. And for a long time, the story of Africa has been told sometimes by foreigners and sometimes with a slant towards negativity. SCI Africa would like to network with the Catholic journalists in Africa to facilitate the telling of Africa's story by Africans from a Catholic faith perspective, giving visibility to the church events that take place on the continent of Africa.
So what has been the reaction so far from Catholics there in the region?
Well, so far we have had a good reaction, particularly because we have received some goodwill messages from church leaders, including some bishops, especially those under the Continental Bishops' Conference called SECAM. We have also had goodwill messages from lay people and different groups of the churches that form the faith base in Africa. And so the reaction is positive. We look forward to collaborating with more clergy, religious, and the laity to tell Africa's story.
What are some of the stories or topics that you'll be covering?
Well, we would like to see what takes place at the grassroots. What is it that people go through in their daily lives? And what is it that Africa can offer to the rest of the world and to the universal church? We would like to do interviews with the different groups of the church at the grassroots in parishes, in the different institutions of the church, and also give voice to the bishops and the priests and the lay and the religious who are in daily contact with the faithful, and what is it that they are doing that could be of a good service and of good knowledge to the rest of the universal church.
Well, what do you think in that collaboration, what do you think are the biggest challenges for Africa right now, for the church?
For the church, of course, there is the challenge of having that faith reach out to everybody. There are areas in Africa where people do not have the opportunity even to have Mass once a month or even once in 2 months. There are remote areas in Africa where the priest has to travel 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers just to celebrate Mass on a Sunday. There are priests who have to go through the challenge of saying, say, 4 or 5 Masses on a single Sunday. So these are the kind of stories that we would like to tell. But also at the governance level, the many countries in Africa face the challenge of bad governance, and the clergy, the bishops have the challenge of criticizing these leaders who have bad governance structures. And so we will be able to give visibility to these church leaders who are trying to bring order, stewardship into the life of the people on the continent of Africa.
Well, this is so important, and like I said, right now you need this kind of new service in Africa, and of course we'll be praying for the church there on the continent. Father Don Bosco Anyala, the head of Aussie Africa, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Staying in Africa, Pope Francis will be there in less than a month for his 6th foreign trip of 2019. The Pope will be going to Southeast Africa to visit Mozambique, Madagascar, and Mauritius starting on September 4th. Father Bernardo Swati is from Mozambique. He works for Vatican Radio as the head of the Portuguese section for Africa. Father, you come from the Diocese of Pemba in the north of the country. What's the mood ahead of the visit, and how are preparations going?
That's really a reason for a great joy, a reason for a great jubilation of the people. I know that everywhere in the country are preparing for this visit with prayers, with study sessions about the Pope, what the Pope is, what the Pope does, who is the Pope. All these initiatives are there to help people to prepare for this very important occasion for our people and for our church in Mozambique by the coming of the Pope Francis.
About 30% of the population in Mozambique is Catholic. Tell us a little bit about the history of the church.
It's a church that went through many challenges, especially in the first decade, from 1975 to the end of the 1980s. That was a very difficult church, let us say, because of the regime at that time. The communism regime and the difficulties to live and witness your faith were very great. And I would say the church had many problems in that period. So the church is a ministerial church. What does it mean? So in the small Christian communities, everyone has a very important place and role to play. So nobody is left behind. So the church is a family. And this idea of church as a family of God came to the Synod of Bishops for Africa in 1994. And it was a very big joy to have Pope John Paul II to come in 1988.
According to the Pew Research Center, more than 170 million Catholics live in sub-Saharan Africa, where Mozambique is, and in that region, the number of Christians is projected to double between 2010 and 2050. Why do you think the faith is growing so rapidly in parts of Africa while it's plummeting in the United States and in Europe?
In Mozambique, as like in other African countries, I think our cultural background, I will say that our cultural background is more for welcoming this relationship with God, the relationship with the other. I feel that in our cultural background, there is a sense of welcoming this religious sense of life, this feeling that life is not just producing, consuming, eating, not eating, but life is somewhere else. This is my feeling.
It is so interesting to hear about the church in Mozambique and to hear about their anticipating Pope Francis' upcoming visit. Father Bernardo Swati with Vatican Radio, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Up next, Pope Francis has a gift for Christians in Syria, and how a 17th century artist depicted the Assumption of Mary. Pope Francis says he is sending a gift to Christians in Syria.
Numero di rosari destinati ai fratelli della Siria.
The Holy Father is sending 6,000 blessed rosaries to the faithful there. On the Feast of the Assumption, Pope Francis says the prayer made with faith is powerful, and he calls on Christians to join him in praying the rosary for peace in the Middle East and the rest of the world. Today's Feast of the Assumption is a holy day of obligation for Catholics. It commemorates the end of the Blessed Virgin Mary's earthly life and her assumption, body and soul, to heaven. Artists have depicted the event for centuries, including in one painting at the National Gallery of Art. Joining us now is Jim Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith. Jim, welcome back into the program. Tell us, we're looking today at a painting from the studio of Peter Paul Rubens. Tell us a little bit about this unique piece of art.
Sure. You know, this scene is a copy, it's a sketch of a magnificent altarpiece in the Cathedral of Antwerp, completed by Peter Paul Rubens, who was the master Baroque painter of the 17th century. Rubens was admired and known for his large-scale dramatic compositions with a lot of movement and intense color. And that's exactly what we see here, right? Everything is moving in this beautiful scene. We see Mary, she's being assumed into heaven. She's being carried by a choir of angels, and two of the angels hold a wreath in their hand. They're ready to crown her as Queen of Heaven. And then below them, we see a crowd around the empty tomb of Mary. We see some biblical figures, women around the tomb. Perhaps they're the Marys of the gospel. And then we see the apostles. And one of the apostles is raising his hands to the heavens, praising God for this glorious moment. But notice that the apostle's back is turned to us, which is to indicate that we are to share in his perspective. We are to join in this chorus of praise to God for the Assumption of Mary.
It's incredible when you look at all the detail you're describing here. What do you think the artist is trying to teach us in this depiction of the Assumption?
You know, in a way, Mary's entire life was a preparation for that time when she would be united with God, who chose her to bear his Son into the world, and in the Holy Spirit, in the power of the Holy Spirit, who was the spouse of Mary. So in a way, her entire life is preparing her for this moment when she will be assumed body and soul into heaven. And what we are learning from this beautiful image, the artist is teaching us, is that in a way this is the hope of all of us, right? We are hoping for that eternal union with God, where we will join the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in the company of the angels and the saints and Mary, who is Queen of Heaven.
It's incredible to think about all the deep theological values that are just in one painting here. You know, it's not known for certain if Rubens painted this all himself or completed this all himself, but we know he himself was Catholic. He had a lot of paintings that involved Christianity in general. What do we know about his faith?
Sure. You know, Rubens painted many, many religious subjects, and oftentimes he would have these very dramatic scenes of biblical stories, and of course, the tradition of the church, the teachings and the faith of the church. So we know that he was devout, that he expressed his faith in these magnificent paintings that we are still enjoying today.
So like I said, this is one particular painting that we're looking at today, but obviously over the years, so many people have depicted the Assumption of Mary. How in general do artists tend to approach this particular kind of the Assumption itself?
You know, we know that well before 1950, when Pope Pius XII defined as a matter of faith the dogma of the Assumption, we know that before that, belief in Mary's Assumption, her being assumed body and soul into heaven, was part of Catholic tradition and part of Catholic belief for centuries. And so I think artists and musicians and poets have always celebrated Mary's Assumption in paint, in word, in music, through the ages. And we see this beautiful painting as one very good example of that tradition.
It's so fascinating to learn about this, and obviously, like I said, each of these artists have their own take on the Assumption, and we can learn so much from them. Jim Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
And we hope all of you, our EWTN viewers, have had a blessed day in praying and reflecting on the Assumption of Mary. And that concludes our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.